Is everyone equally responsible for and will be equally affected by climate change?
Not everyone is equally responsible for climate change, and not everyone is equally affected by it either. Of course, individuals contribute to climate change through their routine everyday activities like travel or consumption choices, and sometimes even through illegal activities like burning or dumping hazardous waste. But the main responsibility lies elsewhere. If we look at climate change in terms of contribution to problems, the sheer amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and foreknowledge, so knowing about the consequences of one's actions and going ahead with them anyway, it is very clear that state and corporate level behavior is to blame here. For example, a research study by Heed in 2014 found that between 1854 and 2010, only 90 leading producers of gas, oil, coal, and cement were cumulatively responsible for 63% of CO2 and methane emissions worldwide.
Firstly, we are not all in the same metaphorical boat. The rich nations are in large, fancy ships that can face the storm a lot better than the fragile little boats poor people and nations are in. The poorer the communities, the more vulnerable they are to climate change. One estimate suggests that 90% of the costs and 98% of the deaths associated with climate breakdown are faced by people in the global south. Secondly, we are not equally responsible for the mess we face. Let's consider carbon dioxide emissions. Between 1990 and 2015, the richest 1% of the world's population was responsible for more than twice as much carbon dioxide as the poorest 50% of the world. In the same period, the richest 10% of the world's population was responsible for around 52% of global carbon dioxide emissions. The global north is responsible for 92% of all excess global carbon dioxide emissions. Meanwhile, the global south, which disproportionately suffers from the fallouts from climate crisis due to excess carbon dioxide, is responsible for only 8%. And what about energy consumption? 20% of UK citizens are in the top 5% of global energy consumers, as are, for example, 40% of Germans. Compare this to India, where only 0.02%. I'll repeat this, 0.02% of people are in this category. Even the poorest 20% of Britons use over 5 times as much energy per person than the bottom billion in India. The richest 10% of people consume 20 times more energy than the poorest 10%. If you think in terms of transport, the richest 10% people use 187 times more fuel than the poorest 10%. I could go on, but I trust you get the point.
The consequences of climate change, temperature rise, changed weather patterns, increased likelihood of extreme weather events, can all result in resource scarcity and poverty. These exacerbate the existing structural inequalities of wealth and power, acting as a sort of threat multiplier. So, for example, in vulnerable regions and communities that have existing inequalities, history of conflict, already limited resource options, the impact of climate change for people's livelihoods can be really severe, and the consequences can involve displacement of people, political and social instability, perhaps even degradation of human rights. Now, it is important that we don't fall into colonial or racist stereotypes here about the global south and people there, and that we remember that these current inequalities are not somehow natural, but they are a consequence of historical and contemporary global political and economic decisions. So we must not absolve the elite decision makers of responsibility here. And we must not allow climate change to be used to legitimize increased monitoring or surveillance, or any kind of military or other coercive interventions.